On the 8th of September 2022, before the world even knew Queen Elizabeth II had died, something else happened in that same instant, something almost nobody noticed at the time. Prince William, without signing a single document, without a ceremony, without a headline, became one of the wealthiest landowners in Britain. And 2 years later, the first person he removed from his newly inherited empire wasn't a stranger. It was Queen Camilla's own sister. This is the real story of what actually landed in William's hands the day his grandmother died, and what he's done with it since. No rumors, no invented palace whispers, just what's actually on the record, and why it matters more than most headlines let on. Let's start with the mechanism itself, because this is the part almost nobody explains properly. The instant Charles became king, a 700-year-old institution called the Duchy of Cornwall passed automatically to William. Not through a will, not through a court, automatically by law, the way it has for every Prince of Wales since 1337, when King Edward III created the estate specifically for his son, Edward the Black Prince, the very first Duke of Cornwall. That's not a symbolic title. It's a sprawling, functioning business empire, roughly 130,000 acres of land spread across more than 20 counties in England and Wales, farmland, historic castles, holiday cottages, commercial buildings, almost the entire archipelago of the Isles of Scilly, half of Dartmoor. The estate is valued at somewhere north of $1 billion, and it generates William an income of tens of millions of pounds every single year. Money that, by long tradition, funds the working life of whoever holds the title Prince of Wales. But here's where things get strange. William doesn't legally have to pay tax on that income. The Duchy of Cornwall operates under a centuries-old exemption, treated as a private estate rather than a standard company. And yet, following the same practice his father set decades earlier, William pays income tax on it voluntarily. It's one of those details that sounds like a footnote, but actually says a lot about how carefully the modern monarchy manages its public image. Because an heir to the throne who visibly didn't pay tax on a billion-dollar inheritance would be a story the palace could never fully control. And that's really the through line of this entire story, because inheriting the Duchy of Cornwall wasn't just about William gaining wealth, it was about William gaining control. Real operational control over an institution that had spent the previous 17 years being run according to his father's priorities. And very quietly, without a single press conference, William began changing what that meant. Which brings us to the story that actually made headlines, the one that gave people outside royal finance circles their first real glimpse into how differently William intended to run things. Back in 2005, when Charles married Camilla, he brought her into a family that came with its own institutions, its own staff, and its long-standing ways of doing things. One of the very first appointments Charles made afterward was hiring Camilla's younger sister, Annabel Elliot, as the Duchy of Cornwall's chief interior designer. Elliot was, by any independent measure, genuinely accomplished. She'd go on to be named one of the most influential interior designers in Britain, with work spanning holiday cottages on the Isles of Scilly, historic properties like Restormel Castle, a converted barn-turned-guesthouse at Dumfries House in Scotland, and a 20-bedroom pub refurbishment at Charles's Poundbury development in Dorset. For almost 2 decades, that arrangement simply continued, largely unquestioned, tucked inside routine financial paperwork that almost nobody outside the estate ever read. Elliot was paid, according to figures later obtained by the Telegraph, anywhere between roughly £19,000 and £82,000 a year in fees and commission, plus additional reimbursements for furniture and furnishings. Modest sums against $1 billion estate, but a steady, long-running arrangement nonetheless. And notably, reporting at the time pointed out she'd been brought on without the position ever being opened to competing bids. Then, in July 2024, the Duchy of Cornwall published its routine integrated annual report. Buried inside the accounting was a detail that took real financial journalists to spot. For the first time in roughly 20 years, there was no payment recorded to Annabel Elliot, nothing for the 2023 to 2024 period. the Telegraph confirmed what the numbers implied. Sources told the paper that Prince William would no longer be employing Elliot, though they were careful to add that this wasn't a reflection of the quality of her work. But here's where things get strange again, because no reflection on her work is exactly the kind of careful, deliberately vague language palace sources reach for when something has clearly shifted beneath the surface. Royal commentator Emma Griffiths, discussing the story publicly, put it plainly. Since William took over as Duke of Cornwall, he'd taken Elliot off the payroll, and it had caused, in her words, a few ripples and a few headlines. Other sources framed it differently again, suggesting simply that her extensive work across the estate was now considered complete, and that Duchy staff had learned enough from her over the years to continue without her. Whatever the precise internal reasoning, the optics were impossible to miss. William inherits the duchy in September 2022. Within roughly 2 years, the one person on that payroll tied directly to Camilla's family is quietly gone. No scandal alleged, no wrongdoing claimed by anyone, just a 20-year professional relationship that ended the moment the man signing the checks changed. And that's really the story that deserves far more attention than it got, not because it proves some dramatic family feud, which the actual reporting never claims, but because of what it reveals about how power inside the monarchy actually transfers. It isn't loud, it isn't public. It happens inside annual financial disclosures that 99% of the public will never read, buried in line items about furniture reimbursements and arm's-length business transactions. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because the Annabelle Elliott story is really just one visible thread in something much bigger, the broader question of how the Duchy of Cornwall actually gets scrutinized and how much of it stays hidden by design. For years, transparency campaigners and members of parliament have raised concerns about exactly this structure. Because the duchy isn't a government department, it isn't subject to the same freedom of information rules as most public institutions, despite generating income tied directly to publicly known land and historic royal privilege. Its accounts are published annually, yes, but only in the form the duchy chooses to disclose. Individual contracts, specific tenant arrangements, and internal decision-making stay firmly behind closed doors, unless, like the Elliott payments, they happen to surface in a summary line that a journalist notices. That opacity has made the duchy a recurring subject of political debate. Critics have pointed to its unusual tax treatment, its exemption from corporation tax, and the voluntary rather than mandatory nature of William's income tax payments as evidence that an institution this large, generating this much money, deserves a level of public accountability closer to what any other landowning business would face. Defenders counter that the duchy predates the modern British state itself by nearly 400 years, that it's always operated as the private inheritance of the heir to the throne rather than a state institution, and that voluntary tax payments already go well beyond what's legally required. Neither side of that argument is going away anytime soon, and that's exactly why moments like the Elliott payroll story matter so much whenever they surface. They're rare, concrete data points in an institution that otherwise reveals almost nothing about how it actually operates day to day. So what does this all add up to when you strip away the speculation and stick only to what's actually documented? William inherited, automatically and instantly, one of the oldest and most valuable private estates in Britain, a role that comes with enormous income, enormous land, and remarkably little public oversight. Within 2 years of taking control, he made at least one clear, confirmed change to how that estate was staffed, ending a 2-decade arrangement tied to his stepmother's family, through a decision so quiet it only became public because of a routine accounting disclosure. And that single, verified data point sits inside a much larger, ongoing debate about just how much transparency an institution like the Duchy of Cornwall actually owes the public whose historic land and tradition it's built on.
What we don't actually know, and what responsible reporting has never claimed to know, is William's personal reasoning, his private conversations with his father, or whether this decision reflects any kind of family tension at all. The sourced reporting is consistent on one point. Officially, this was framed as an operational decision, not a personal one. Anyone telling you with total confidence exactly what William was thinking or reconstructing private conversations inside Clarence's house is filling in gaps that the actual record simply doesn't support. And maybe that's the more interesting takeaway here than any dramatic palace feud narrative could offer. The British monarchy runs on precisely this kind of quiet, procedural power. Not public confrontations, not dramatic declarations, just documents, disclosures, and decisions made behind closed doors that occasionally, briefly become visible to the rest of us, and then close again just as fast. The Duchy of Cornwall will keep generating tens of millions of pounds a year for William, exactly as it did for his father before him, and exactly as it will for Prince George one day, when this same 700-year cycle repeats itself once more. Whether the public ever gets a genuinely full picture of how that money moves, who benefits from it, and what changes each new Duke of Cornwall quietly makes, that's a question that remains very much open. If you found this breakdown useful, it's worth remembering just how much of royal finance operates exactly like this, hidden in plain sight, inside documents nobody reads, until someone finally does. Let me know in the comments which royal financial story you'd like unpacked next, with the same standard: real sources only, no invented drama required.